The air hung heavy over Jerusalem that day, a stillness that gnawed at the edges of the world, a quiet so deep it seemed the earth itself held its breath. Year 33, after Christ, and the city sprawled beneath a sky gone gray, a sprawl of dust and stone, and the clamor of pilgrims come for Passover. Men bartered in the markets, their voices sharp as knives, while the smoke of sacrifice curled upward from altars stained with blood. But up on Golgotha, the hill they called the Skull, there was no commerce, no haggling, only death, stark and final, 3 crosses rising like blackened teeth against a horizon that bled red at the seams. Lucius Verus stood there, boots planted in the dirt, a centurion of Rome carved from 35 years of war and iron. His face bore the scars of Gaul, jagged lines etched by blades and time, and his eyes, gray as slate, watched the world with the cold indifference of a man who'd seen too much. He'd marched through blood-soaked fields, heard the screams of the dying, and slept under skies torn by thunder, but he knelt to no gods. Rome was his altar, the legion his creed. Yet now, beneath this gray shroud, he felt something shift, a tremor in the soul he'd long buried. Watching the man on the center cross, Jesus of Nazareth hung there, nailed and broken, a king without a crown, his chest rising slow, then slower still. The crowd pressed in around Lucius, a tide of flesh and fury. Some hurled stones and curses, their voices raw with hate. "If you're the Son of God, come down!" While others wept, women in shawls clutching each other, tears cutting tracks through the dust on their faces. Priests lingered at the edges, white robes billowing, their eyes hard as flint, watching a victory they'd carved with their own hands. And yet all of them, mockers, mourners, masters, waited breathless for something they could not name. Then it came. The man on the cross lifted his head one last time and spoke, soft as a whisper, sharp as a blade. "It is finished." His head fell, and the world broke. What followed was no ordinary death, no common execution. The ground shuddered, the sky darkened, and 5 events unfolded that would sear themselves into the earth's bones. A soldier like Lucius, forged in steel and skepticism, would see things that day that'd haunt him to his grave. So listen close, because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. 5 moments that shook the world, and maybe, just maybe, they'll shake you too. The moment hung there, brittle and sharp, like a blade poised above the neck of the world. Jesus of Nazareth spoke his last. "It is finished," and his head slumped, a crown of thorns cutting deeper into flesh already torn. Blood dripped slow from the cross, pooling in the dirt, red against the gray of Golgotha's stones. Lucius Verus stood rooted, his spear clutched tight, watching the life bleed out of the man they'd nailed up like a thief. He'd seen death before, hundreds of times in the mud of Gaul, in the dust of Syria. But this was different. This was a quiet that roared. Then the earth answered. A shudder ran through the ground, deep and low, a growl rising from the belly of creation. The stones beneath Lucius's boots trembled, then split, cracks spidering out like veins of black lightning. The hill groaned, a beast waking from some ancient sleep, and rocks tumbled down the slope, heavy and heedless, smashing into each other with a sound like bones breaking. Dust rose thick, a choking cloud that stung the eyes and throat, and the air itself seemed to howl, a wind born of no sky he knew. The crowd broke. Men screamed and fell, clawing at the dirt, their voices swallowed by the earth's fury. A woman near Lucius shrieked, "The wrath of God!" Her shawl torn loose as she stumbled, arms flailing like a bird caught in a storm. Marcus, the young soldier at Lucius's side, dropped to his knees, his helmet rattling against stone, muttering prayers to Jupiter through chattering teeth. Gaius, older, harder, gripped his sword and cursed, "Stand up, you fools!" But even his voice shook, thin against the roar. Lucius held his ground, though the world buckled beneath him. He drove his spear into the earth, leaning on it as the quake rolled on, relentless, a wave of rage that spared nothing. He'd felt tremors before, in camps pitched too close to fault lines, but those were mere twitches, the earth's restless shifting. This was no twitch. This was a cry, a bellow from depths no man could fathom, as if the land itself mourned the blood soaking into it. He looked up at the cross, at the lifeless form hanging there, and for a moment, just a moment, he wondered if the woman was right. Was this wrath or something else? The shaking slowed, then stopped, leaving a silence heavier than before. Dust settled slow, coating the crowd in gray, their faces masks of fear and ash. Lucius pulled his spear free, his knuckles white, and scanned the hill. Cracked stones lay scattered, a battlefield of their own, and the crosses stood still, unmoved, as if rooted deeper by the chaos. He turned to Marcus, voice low and steady. "Get up! It's over." But he knew it wasn't. The earth had spoken, and its voice lingered. A warning or a lament, he couldn't tell. One thing was sure, this was no ordinary death. Something bigger had begun. The silence after the quake was a weight, a shroud laid over Golgotha, heavy with dust and the stink of fear. Lucius Verus stood there, spear in hand, the earth still beneath his boots but humming with something alive, something restless. The crosses loomed above, Jesus of Nazareth dead in the center, his blood a dark stain against the wood, and the crowd, shaken, scattered, picked themselves up slow, their voices hushed as if speaking might wake the hill again. But the waking had only begun. It started low, a sound like stone grinding stone, a groan from the tombs carved into the hillside beyond the crosses. Lucius turned, his eyes narrowing, and saw the slabs shift. Ancient doors of rock, sealed for years, maybe centuries, now cracking open. Dust spilled out, a gray veil rising, and from the shadows within, figures stepped forth. Not ghosts, not shades, but men and women, flesh and bone, wrapped in shrouds torn and yellowed by time. Their eyes burned bright, alive in a way that defied the grave. And they moved slow, deliberate, as if drawn by the blood on the cross. An old man came first, his beard white as frost, his frame thin but unbowed. He stopped a dozen paces from Lucius, staring past him to the cross, and his lips parted. "He has broken it. The Lamb has shattered death." The voice was dry, a rasp from a throat long silent, but it carried, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Lucius stepped forward, his spear raised, not to strike but to steady himself. "Who are you?" he demanded, his words hard as iron. "What sorcery is this?" The old man turned those burning eyes on him, and a smile cracked his face, faint and strange. "No sorcery, soldier. Salvation." More came. A woman, young once, her hair tangled beneath a shroud, her hands folded as if in prayer. A man, broad-shouldered, his arms marked by scars older than Lucius's own. They stood there, a silent host, gazing at the cross with something like awe, something like hunger. Marcus whimpered at Lucius's side, his sword half drawn. "They're demons, sir. Jupiter save us." Gaius spat into the dirt, his voice a growl. "Draw steel and cut them down." But Lucius raised a hand, sharp. "Hold! They're not attacking." His gut twisted, a cold knot of fear he hadn't felt since his first battle, but he held their gaze, searching for answers in those impossible eyes. The old man spoke again, stepping closer, his shroud trailing dust. "He died so we might rise. The chains are broken, and the dawn is near." Lucius shook his head, his mind racing. He'd seen men cheat death, wounds stanched, fevers broken. But this was no healer's trick. These were the dead, walking, breathing, speaking of a lamb and a dawn he didn't understand. He glanced back at the cross, at the lifeless form of Jesus, and a question clawed at him. If death could be undone, what power had this man wielded? What force had torn the tombs apart? The hill stood quiet now, but the air thrummed, alive with the weight of the impossible. The air grew still after the tombs opened, a stillness that pressed down on Golgotha like a hand on a throat, choking out sound, leaving only the hum of the impossible. Lucius Verus stood among the risen, their eyes fixed on the cross, their words of lambs and broken death ringing in his ears. Dust hung thick, A gray curtain over the hill, and the crowd, those who hadn't fled, watched in silence, their breaths shallow, their faces pale as the stone beneath them. The world felt unmoored, a ship torn from its anchor, drifting into waters no man had charted. Then came the sound, sharp and final, a tearing that cut through the quiet like a blade through flesh. Lucius turned, his gaze dropping from the hill to the city below, to the temple rising proud against Jerusalem's sprawl. The veil, the great curtain woven thick as a man's hand, dyed with the colors of heaven, guarding the Holy of Holies, split apart. From top to bottom it tore, a wound opened in the heart of the sacred, and the rip echoed, a crack of thunder without a storm. He didn't see it, not yet, but he heard it, felt it in his bones, a shiver that ran deeper than the quake. Down the slope, the priests erupted. They spilled from the temple's gates, white robes flapping like wings of broken birds, their voices rising in wails and shouts. One fell to his knees, clawing at the earth. "Blasphemy! The Lord has forsaken us!" While another raised his arms, his face twisted. "Judgment comes!" The crowd below stirred, a tide of whispers swelling to cries, some pointing at the torn veil now visible, hanging limp, a banner of ruin. Lucius watched, his spear heavy in his grip, and the air shifted, cold, sudden, a wind born of no breeze, brushing his skin like the touch of something vast. He'd heard of the veil before, in passing, from soldiers who'd guarded the city's edges. A wall of cloth, they said, thicker than armor, stitched to keep men from the face of God. Only the high priest crossed it once a year, with blood and fear. Now it lay sundered, and Lucius felt the weight of that sundering, a door flung wide, a barrier shattered, an invitation or a warning, he couldn't tell. He looked back at the cross, at Jesus, dead and still, and wondered what power could reach beyond the grave to tear down the walls of heaven itself. Marcus muttered at his side, voice trembling. "Sir, what does it mean?" "The temple, it's open," Gaius snorted, his sword still in hand. "Means chaos, boy. These Jews will riot." But Lucius said nothing. He stared down at the city, at the priest weeping and the people shouting, and felt something stir in him. Not fear, not yet, but a question, sharp and unyielding. If the veil was gone, if the sacred lay bare, what stood between man and the divine? What had this man's death unleashed? The hill was quiet now, but the silence sang, alive with the echo of that tear. The veil hung torn below, a wound in the temple's heart, and the air over Golgotha grew taut, strung tight like a bowstring before the arrow flies. Lucius Verus stood amid the dust and the risen dead, their eyes still fixed on the cross, their whispers of salvation fading into the wind. The hill bore the scars of the quake, stones split and scattered, and the crowd, what remained of it, stood hushed, staring at the man who died, Jesus of Nazareth, his body limp against the wood, blood dried black in the creases of his flesh. Then the sky fell silent. It came sudden, a darkness not born of night, not creeping slow from the east, but a shroud dropped whole over the sun at noon. Black and absolute, it swallowed the light, a weight that pressed against the eyes and chest, cold as the grave's own breath. Lucius felt it settle, a shadow alive, pulsing, and the hill vanished. Crosses, crowd, all gone into the void. 3 hours it held, an eternity carved from midnight, and the air turned sharp, stinging his lungs with every breath. He'd known darkness, nights in Gaul with no fire, storms over Syrian plains. But this was no storm, no night. This was judgment or mourning, a cry from the heavens too vast to hear. The crowd broke again, their voices rising shrill in the black. Prayers, curses, pleas to gods they'd half forgotten. Marcus fell beside Lucius, his sword clattering useless. "Sir, we're damned!" His breath a sob. Gaius stood rigid, muttering oaths to Mars, his knuckles white on his hilt. Lucius said nothing, his spear planted firm, his eyes straining against the dark. He thought of battles lost, of men screaming under a sky torn by rain. But this was deeper, heavier, a silence that roared louder than any thunder. He turned to the cross, unseen now, and felt it still. The man there, dead yet present, a weight in the void. When the light returned, it came slow, a thin bleed of gray at the edges, peeling back the shroud like skin from a wound. The hill emerged stark and pale, the crosses standing as they had, Jesus at the center, his head bowed, his chest still. Lucius blinked against the glare, his throat dry, and saw the man anew. Not just a body, not just a rebel, but something else, something that pulled at the edges of his soul. The darkness had mourned him, the earth had shaken for him, the tombs had opened at his death. And now, standing there, Lucius felt the words rise unbidden, raw and sure. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Marcus stared, eyes wide. "Sir?" His voice a whisper. Gaius laughed, short and bitter. "You're mad, Lucius. He's dead." But Lucius held the cross in his gaze, the weight of those 3 hours pressing down, the truth clawing free from years of steel and blood. He'd seen too much. The ground's rage, the dead walking, the veil torn. In this darkness, this living shadow sealed it. The man on the cross had broken something, or birthed it, and Lucius was no longer the soldier he'd been. The hill stood quiet, but the truth sang loud, a hymn he couldn't unhear. The light held now, thin and pale, a fragile thing over Golgotha's broken stones. Lucius Verus stood beneath the cross, the words he'd spoken. Truly this man was the Son of God, hanging heavy in the air, a weight he couldn't shed. The hill lay quiet, the darkness gone, the tombs open and still, the veil torn below like a scar across Jerusalem's heart. Jesus of Nazareth hung there no more, taken down by a rich man cloaked in linen, a woman weeping at his side, her sobs a soft keening against the wind. Lucius watched them carry him off, a body wrapped tight, borne to some tomb he'd never see. He turned from the hill, spear in hand, and walked down through the dust and the shattered rock. The crowd had thinned, some fleeing to the city, others lingering, their eyes hollow with what they'd witnessed. Marcus trailed him, silent now, his prayers to Jupiter spent. Gaius muttered still, "Fools talk, all of it." But his voice was brittle, a blade dulled by doubt. Lucius said nothing, his boots grinding the earth, his mind a storm of stone and blood and light. He'd come to Golgotha a soldier of Rome, a man of steel and orders, and now he left it something else. Unmade, remade, a vessel cracked by what he'd seen. Night fell as he reached the barracks, the sky clear, stars sharp as nails. He sat alone, the lamp's flame dancing, and saw it all again. The earth's roar, the dead rising, the veil's ruin, the darkness that mourned. 3 days later, whispers came, soldiers at the gate, voices low. The tomb was empty, the man gone, risen, they said. Lucius listened, his scarred hands still, and felt no surprise, only a quiet that ran deep. He left the legion soon after, shed his armor, walked north to the hills where men spoke of a king reborn. He carried the echoes of that day, 5 moments burned into his bones, a truth he'd never unlearn. This was no tale for children, no fireside yarn. 5 events broke the world that day. The earth shook, the tombs opened, the veil fell, the dark wept, and a soldier saw. They echo still, across centuries, across souls, a question carved in stone. What power could do this? Lucius found his answer, or it found him. And you, what do you make of it? A soldier's madness, or a truth too big to hold? Tell me below. Hit that like if it stirred you, subscribe if you want more. The echoes remain, and they're calling.